Ever get this like nagging feeling that the stock market is kind of a rigged game?
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, like you're not alone if you think that.
Right.
And that's exactly what we're going to be diving deep into today.
Okay.
So, is the stock market rigged? And to help us unpack this really complex question, we've had a really fascinating mix of sources.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we've got videos from economists like Richard Wolff. He's got the Ask Prof. Wolff channel.
Okay, yeah.
We've got financial analysts like the folks over at Trading Lab and Money Matters TV. Even a comedian, Jon Stewart. He did a whole episode on his show, The Problem with Jon Stewart.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we've got some even spicier takes, like from a channel called The Ponzi Factor.
Ooh, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah, they go pretty far with their theories.
Okay.
But before we get into like the really juicy stuff,
Sure.
I think it's important to define what we even mean by rigged.
Right, because it can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Yeah, when you hear that word rigged, what comes to mind?
Yeah. Well, I think for a lot of people, it evokes images of like backroom deals, secret handshakes,
Yeah.
maybe even outright illegal activity.
Yeah, like some kind of insider trading or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not always so blatant.
Right.
Sometimes rigged can be more subtle.
Okay.
Like think of it as a game where some players start with a massive head start. Even if everyone's technically playing by the same rules.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. So it's not necessarily about cheating,
Mm-hmm.
but about a system that's inherently tilted in favor of certain players.
Okay, so like a tilted playing field.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that analogy.
And one of the most glaring examples of this is the huge concentration of wealth at the very top.
Yeah. Richard Wolff, from that Ask Prof. Wolff video, he brings up this really striking statistic.
Yeah.
He says that the top 10% of Americans own something like 80% of all stocks.
Wow. Yeah, that's a huge imbalance right from the start.
Right. So even before we get into any of like the nitty-gritty details of, market manipulation or anything like that, just the fact that so much wealth is concentrated in the hands of so few people, that already suggests that the game might be rigged.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Wolff doesn't just stop at the statistics.
Right.
He actually goes on to compare this level of wealth concentration to historical systems like slavery,
Wow.
arguing that they both share this fundamental flaw,
Okay.
where a tiny elite controls the resources and reaps most of the rewards, while the vast majority are left with practically nothing.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful comparison.
Yeah, and he even suggests that, maybe we need a constitutional amendment to really address this disparity.
Yeah, he goes there.
He does.
He definitely goes there.
Yeah.
But okay, so let's say we even set aside the like ethical implications for a second and just focus on the fairness aspect.
Right.
Is the playing field even level for those within that wealthy 10%?
Well, that's where the issue of information asymmetry comes in.
Okay.
Wolff gives some pretty startling examples in his video.
Yeah.
He talks about how corporations can legally keep multiple sets of books, essentially showing different versions of their financial health to different audiences.
Oh, so it's like you're showing one set of books to like the public and then another set of books to like their investors or something.
It's kind of like that, yeah.
Wow. So it's like some investors are getting this like VIP backstage pass while the rest of us are stuck out in the general admission area, just trying to like guess what's really going on.
Yeah, exactly. And this information gap is further widened by the preferential treatment that's often given to like big brokerage firms.
Okay.
They often receive crucial market data ahead of everyone else.
Well, like they get a head start.
Yeah, it's like playing poker where one player can see everyone else's cards.
Oh, wow. That does not sound very fair.
No, not really.
But hold on, because we haven't even gotten to the really mind-bending stuff yet. So James Lai, in his 5149 video, introduces this wild concept of cryptographic signals.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, he basically argues that like major financial institutions, they use specific numbers like day highs or even, Elon Musk's notorious 420 tweet to like communicate and coordinate their market moves.
Yeah, it's like they're sending secret messages through stock prices.
Wait, so they're like speaking in code?
That's the theory.
Wow.
Yeah, Lyon breaks down how these seemingly random numbers could actually function as like a coded language for insiders.
Okay, I gotta admit that sounds a little out there.
Yeah, it's definitely a fringe theory.
But it's interesting to think about.
It's intriguing.
Like, even if you're skeptical about, secret codes and hidden messages, there are more concrete examples of market manipulation that are kind of hard to ignore.
Oh, absolutely.
And the Trading Lab and Money Matters TV videos, they outline some of the more overt tactics that are used.
Yeah, things like pump and dump schemes, wash trading, exploiting stop-loss orders.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one.
Okay.
Pump and dump schemes. I've heard of those before.
Yeah.
Isn't that where someone, spreads hype about a stock, artificially inflates its price, and then sells off all their shares before everyone else realizes it's basically a dud?
Yeah, precisely. It's like creating a mirage of value and then vanishing before the illusion fades.
Oh, wow. That's pretty sneaky.
Yeah, it's definitely manipulative.
Okay, and then what about wash trading?
So wash trading is all about creating this illusion of activity and demand.
Okay.
It involves a trader buying and selling the same stock repeatedly
Okay.
to artificially inflate the trading volume.
So they're basically making it look like there's a lot of interest in a stock,
Exactly.
even if it's really just one person trading with themselves.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow. Okay, and then you mentioned exploiting stop-loss orders.
Right. This one's a bit more complex, but equally manipulative.
Okay, how does that work?
So imagine you set a stop-loss order to automatically sell your stock if it drops below a certain price.
Right. Yeah, to protect yourself.
Exactly, to limit your losses.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some sophisticated players can actually manipulate the market,
Okay.
drive the price down just enough to trigger a wave of these stop-loss orders.
Oh, so they're purposely creating a mini panic
Yeah.
to buy up those shares at a discount?
Exactly. It's a way to profit from other people's fear.
Wow. That's pretty ruthless.
It is. It can be a cutthroat game.
Okay, so with all these advantages and tactics, it's easy to feel like the average investor doesn't stand a chance.
I can see why people would feel that way.
But wait, didn't the GameStop saga prove that sometimes the little guy can win?
Ah, the GameStop saga. That's a fascinating case study.
Yeah.
It's the story that Jon Stewart unpacks so brilliantly in his show.
Yeah.
And it's also covered in that Money Matters TV video.
Right.
It's a truly captivating example of what can happen when everyday investors band together.
Yeah, it's like David versus Goliath for the digital age.
Exactly.
Can you remind us how a bunch of people on Reddit managed to outmaneuver these giant hedge funds?
Sure. So basically, it was a perfect storm of factors.
Right.
First, you had the rise of these commission-free trading apps like Robinhood, which made it so easy for anyone to buy and sell stocks.
Yeah, it was suddenly everyone had access to the same tools that were previously only available to the Wall Street elite.
Exactly. And then you had the power of social media, which allowed these retail investors to connect, share information, coordinate their strategies.
Right. It was this flash mob of investors all buying up GameStop stock at the same time.
Yeah, it was a really unprecedented phenomenon.
But the hedge funds, they had made a critical miscalculation, right?
They had bet heavily against GameStop, assuming it was a failing company.
Right.
This strategy is called short selling,
Okay.
and it backfired spectacularly when the Reddit crowd started buying en masse.
So they were caught off guard.
Totally, it triggered a short squeeze,
Okay.
sending the stock price through the roof.
So it was a massive upset.
Yeah, a stunning victory for the little guy.
It really was, but was it just a fluke or did it signal a real shift in power?
That's a question worth pondering, and speaking of challenging assumptions, the Ponzi factor video takes things in a truly radical direction.
Yeah, they do.
They argue that the entire stock market operates like a giant Ponzi scheme.
Hold on, a Ponzi scheme? Isn't that illegal? How could the entire market be based on something like that?
Well, they argue that while it's not a traditional Ponzi scheme in the sense of outright fraud, the stock market does share some unsettling similarities.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Explain.
Sure. So in a Ponzi scheme, early investors are paid with money from later investors,
Oh, okay.
creating this illusion of profit that eventually collapses when the new money dries up.
Right, right.
The Ponzi Factor channel argues that the stock market relies on a similar influx of new money to fuel its gains.
Oh, so they're saying that without a constant stream of new investors, the whole system could crumble.
That's the core of their argument.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and while it might seem extreme, it does make you think about the long-term sustainability of a system that seems so dependent on perpetual growth.
Yeah, for sure. This is a lot to take in.
It is.
We've gone from talking about subtle advantages to exploring the possibility that the entire market is built on a shaky foundation.
It's a lot to digest.
What's standing out to you so far?
I'm curious what our listeners are thinking at this point.
Right.
What's resonating with you most? Are you surprised by any of these insights, or are they confirming suspicions you already had?
Yeah, it's definitely food for thought. We'll be back in a flash to dig even deeper into these ideas and explore what it all means for the average investor like you.
Sounds good.
Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I am already feeling my head spinning a little bit from everything we've talked about.
It's a lot to take in, right?
It is. It really is. But it's so fascinating.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
One thing that really stood out to me from that last segment was this idea that, even if the market isn't, blatantly rigged, with outright fraud,
Right.
it still seems like it's designed in a way to benefit people who already have a ton of money and power.
Yeah, that's a theme that comes up again and again in a lot of these sources.
Right.
We see it in the wealth concentration at the top, the information advantages that big players have, even just the language that's used to talk about market dynamics. It often feels like a game that's played in a totally different language.
Yeah, it's like they're speaking a secret language that the rest of us just don't understand.
Exactly.
And it's not even just about money, is it?
No, it's about influence and control.
Yeah, one of the videos, I think it was the Money Matters video.
Okay.
They talked about how hedge funds can use their massive resources to basically shape media narratives and public perception.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Which ultimately influences market sentiment.
Right. They have the capital to hire PR firms, lobby politicians, even buy up struggling media outlets,
Wow.
just to control the information flow.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It creates this system where those with the most money can essentially write their own rules.
Yeah, it's like they're playing chess on a global scale.
Mm-hmm.
While most of us are still trying to figure out checkers or something.
Yeah, it's hard to compete with that.
It is. It can feel pretty disheartening.
Yeah, I understand that.
But then you have stories like GameStop, right?
Right.
Where a group of everyday investors actually managed to disrupt the system.
At least for a little while.
Yeah, at least for a little while. Does that give you any hope that real change is possible?
Well, the GameStop saga is interesting because it shows the potential for collective action to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
But it also kind of exposes the limitations of these kinds of movements.
Yeah. It did feel like a turning point at first, right? Everyone was talking about short squeezes and the power of retail investors.
Right. It felt like the little guy was finally getting a win.
But then it seemed like the system adapted pretty quickly.
Exactly. We saw trading platforms like Robinhood restricting access to certain stocks regulators, scrambling to catch up, and of course, a wave of backlash from the establishment.
It's almost like the system glitched for a second.
Yeah.
And then quickly corrected itself.
Like it was never supposed to happen.
Exactly. So is it all just a hopeless cycle?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. Are we destined to be pawns in this game forever?
It can feel that way sometimes.
Or is there any potential for meaningful, lasting change?
I think there are some glimmers of hope.
Okay.
Some argue that stricter regulations are needed
Okay.
to curb those manipulative practices, increase transparency, and just make the market fairer for everyone.
Right. And didn't Jon Stewart's episode talk about payment for order flow?
Yeah.
Where brokers like Robinhood get paid for routing your trades to certain firms.
Right.
And that's actually illegal in some countries.
It is.
So it makes you wonder if similar regulations could work here in the U.S.
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. And then there's the whole issue of dark pools.
Right.
Those private exchanges where big institutions can trade stocks with way less transparency.
Kind of like a hidden market.
Exactly. Wouldn't shining more light on those dark pools help level the playing field?
It could potentially reduce that information asymmetry that we talked about earlier.
Right, because right now it's they're operating in the shadows.
Yeah, it's definitely not very transparent.
Okay, so stricter regulations, more transparency, those are some potential solutions.
Mm-hmm.
But even with all that, some people would argue that a system that's fundamentally designed to prioritize profit can never be truly fair.
That's a valid point.
It's the incentives are always going to be misaligned.
Right.
So that's where I think these alternative models decentralized finance, DeFi, start to get really interesting.
Yeah, DeFi is definitely shaking things up.
Because they're using blockchain technology to create these financial systems that are supposed to be more transparent and accessible.
Yeah.
It's they're building a whole new game with different rules.
Right.
And then there's also this growing movement towards impact investing, where investors put their money into companies that align with their values, whether it's social justice, environmental sustainability, ethical business practices.
Right. It's a way to use your investments to make a positive impact on the world.
So even if the stock market as it exists today feels rigged, there are ways to engage with the financial system in a more conscious and ethical way.
Yeah, I think that's a really important takeaway.
It's about finding alternatives, advocating for change, and just making informed decisions that reflect your values.
Right. It's not just about maximizing profits.
Exactly.
It's about aligning your investments with your values.
So it sounds like we're at this crossroads, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Do we try to fix the existing system or do we create something entirely new?
It's a tough question.
It is. And even with those possibilities, there's still this nagging feeling that the game itself is just rigged.
I understand that.
No matter how hard you try, the house always has the edge.
That's where that Ponzi factor perspective really gets you thinking, right?
It does.
Because if they're right, it's not just about individual bad actors manipulating the system. It's about the very structure of the market that incentivizes this kind of behavior.
Yeah. And that's a really hard thing to change.
It is. It's a systemic problem.
Okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that the stock market is essentially like a giant Ponzi scheme.
Okay.
What does that mean for the average investor like me?
Yeah.
Should we all just cash out and head for the hills?
That's a really personal decision.
Right.
And it depends on your individual risk tolerance, your financial goals, your ethical considerations.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay.
But I think the most important thing is to understand the underlying dynamics of the market. Knowledge is power, even in a system that feels stacked against you.
Right. It's like they say, forewarned is forearmed.
Exactly.
But even with knowledge, isn't there something inherently uncomfortable about participating in a system that you believe is fundamentally flawed?
That's the moral dilemma that a lot of investors face, right?
Yeah.
Do you play the game even if you don't like the rules?
Right.
Or do you try to find alternative ways to build wealth?
And create a more equitable system.
Exactly.
Yeah, these are some tough questions.
They are. There are no easy answers.
But at least by having this conversation, we're starting to see behind the curtain a little bit. We're becoming more aware of the forces at play and the hidden mechanisms that shape the market.
Right, and that awareness is the first step towards making more informed decisions.
Whether you choose to stay in the game, opt out completely, or advocate for change.
I think that's a great point.
Understanding how the market really works is essential.
Absolutely.
I feel like this deep dive has been such a eye-opening experience.
Yeah, me too.
We've gone from basic definitions of rigged to exploring these radical theories about the nature of the market.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has, but I think we're starting to get a much clearer picture of how this whole thing actually works.
Yeah, I think so too.
So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to pose a question to our listeners.
Okay.
Knowing what we know now about the potential inequalities, the manipulation tactics, the systemic flaws, what are your thoughts on participating in the stock market?
Yeah.
Is it a necessary evil?
Right.
Is it a game you can win if you just play smart? Or is it something that we should just try to avoid altogether?
It's a big question.
It is. It's a really big question.
Yeah.
Those are some heavy things to ponder.
Definitely.
But we'll be back soon with the final part of this episode to explore some more potential solutions and hopefully leave you with some food for thought.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the stock market.
And, we've uncovered some pretty unsettling stuff about how the system works.
We have, but knowledge is power, right?
Yep.
So I think now we need to shift gears and talk about some ways that we can actually navigate the system with more awareness.
Right.
Maybe even find some potential solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
One of the things that really stood out to me from the Trading Lab video was this idea that instead of just blindly following influencers or chasing hot tips, you really need to do your own research.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be careful about getting caught up in hype that's fueled by artificial trading volume.
Right. That's so important.
So basically, it's all about becoming a more savvy investor.
Exactly.
But even then, even if we all become super savvy investors, we're still dealing with the systemic issues.
Right.
The tilted playing field that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, the bigger picture stuff.
Exactly. Can those even be addressed?
Well, that's where things get more complicated.
Yeah.
I think some people would argue that we need stricter regulations to really curb those manipulative practices, increase transparency, and just make the market fairer.
Okay, so what kind of regulations are we talking about?
Well, for example, remember in Jon Stewart's episode, He mentioned payment for order flow.
Yeah, where brokers get paid for routing your trades.
Exactly. And that's actually illegal in some countries.
That is.
So, it makes you wonder if similar regulations could work here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good point.
To make sure the brokers are prioritizing their clients' interests.
Yeah, instead of just like chasing profits.
Exactly.
Okay. And then there's also the whole issue of dark pools.
Right, those private exchanges.
Yeah, those are kind of scary.
They operate with way less transparency.
Yeah, it's like this whole hidden market that's happening.
Right.
And most of us have no idea about it.
Exactly.
So wouldn't shining some light on those dark pools help to kind of even things out a little bit?
It could definitely help reduce that information asymmetry.
Right.
That benefits those big players.
Okay, so stricter regulations, more transparency. Those are some potential solutions.
Yeah, I think so.
But even with all that, right? Some people would argue that a system that's like fundamentally designed to prioritize profit can never truly be fair.
That's a really tough argument to counter.
It is, because it's like no matter what you do, the incentives are always going to be misaligned.
Yeah, that's the inherent tension, I think.
Okay, so that's where I think these alternative models like decentralized finance or DeFi start to get really interesting.
They do.
Because they're using blockchain technology to create financial systems that are supposed to be, way more transparent and accessible. It's like they're trying to build a whole new game with completely different rules.
Exactly.
Okay, and then we also talked about impact investing.
Right.
Where you're basically putting your money into companies that align with your values.
Yeah, it's a way to invest with your conscience.
Exactly. So even if the stock market as it exists today feels rigged, there are ways to engage with the financial system in a more conscious and ethical way.
Absolutely.
It's about finding alternatives, advocating for change, and just making decisions that reflect your values.
Right. It's not just about the money.
Yeah, it's about like the bigger picture.
Exactly.
So it sounds like we're kind of at this crossroads.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Do we try to like fix the existing system? Or do we try to create something entirely new?
That's a big question.
It is a huge question, and honestly, this whole deep dive has just given me so much to think about.
Me too.
We've explored the dark side of the market, the potential for change, and some alternative paths forward.
It's been a wild ride.
It really has. So if you're listening out there, what's the main takeaway?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that knowledge is your best defense.
Right.
Keep learning, stay curious, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
And make informed decisions that align with your values and your vision for the future.
I think that's a great message to end on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
It's been great talking with you.